If we're talking about Hammer films, and we're talking about the films that we actually remember them for more than half a century later, we are talking Anthony Hinds. We will call him Tony Hinds because when he was signing autographs in later life, and he signed them where you could actually read them as opposed to a slash across the page, that's how he always signed it, Tony Hinds. The Hinds family was one of the two founding families of Exclusive Films and of Hammer. His father was Will Hinds, who came from jewelry business, bicycling business. He had his fingers and other joints and a lot of other areas, including amateur theatrics. He thought he was funny, and he was in a partnership called Hammer and Smith. Tony Hinds said his father was never funny. Tony Hinds said his father did not like movies. But somehow he got connected with Enrique Carreras in the early 30s to form, I'm not sure exclusive, but definitely Hammer Films. He even had a small role in one of their films, but like a lot of companies out of the 30s, they overexpanded. There was no market. These were the quota-quickie times. It went belly up. Anthony Hinds was not involved with Hammer or Exclusive until during World War II. He went off during the war to India. He has the typical British love-hate affair with the Indian continent. And when he got the chance in the 1970s to write the unrealized Dracula in India, it brought home a lot of memories to him. And I think he actually would have liked to see it been made. But he came back to the company. Hammer came around in 1947 when Exclusive was told there's a market for films, there's a lack of product out there, you really should make your own films. And they were told this by the head, Jack Goodlatte, of the distribution areas of the UK, and his word was, as Michael Carreras said, eat it. So when they incorporated Hammer, there was Will Hinds, Anthony Hinds, Enrique Carreras, and James Carreras. Tony Hinds always said, my father wanted me as part of the company to watch the money. So I came on board very early on. Hinds was the producer. A lot of really badly made, really cheap movies, the kind of films that they used to say they would play while they were cleaning out the movie theater, because if the cleaning crew didn't clear them out, the movie would clear them out. James Carreras could get backing. He got BBC subjects. He took on other subjects. He connected with an American, Robert Lippert, who was a kind of a silent provider of context for 20th Century Fox, and Spiro Skouros. Tony Hinds produced a vast majority of them. Michael Carreras, who was the son of good old Colonel Carreras, would produce the rest. At that point, Hinds was, if he was writing on these, not very much, because they were pumped out so quickly, so simply, it was really hard to screw them up. He was hiring, starting out with the Grayson brothers, was Godfrey Grayson as director. You had Francis Searle. Again, these were journeyman directors. They'd worked with the companies in the 30s and 40s. And then along came Terence Fisher, who became the director most associated with Hammer, probably because he was the best director associated with Hammer. But Anthony Hinds told me as 1955 came, the company was at a crossroads. Television was making inroads. People were not going to theaters. They were staying home. Hammer had all this product, and then the Lippert deal with Fox was done. Tony Hinds saw The Quatermass Experiment, the great serial written by Nigel Neal, which kept everybody out of the pubs, out of the bars, everywhere. The streets were empty, according to people at the time. Tony saw it. He went to talk to his partner, James Carreras, and said, we really need to talk to BBC. We need to make this. But it was just one of maybe 8 or 10 films that year, 1954. There was no reason to think that it was going to be any more popular than, say, the other television-based or radio-based films they've made over the previous 4 or 5 years. Well, it was. In 1955, they had one last Robert Lippert film and a bunch of short subjects, musical short subjects, travelogues, in order to keep Bray Studios going, which by then was their home, and to keep some of the people on hand while they decided, are we going to survive? Well, Quatermass Experiment showed they were going to survive. It was a monster hit in the UK, big hit in the United States as The Creeping Unknown. Hammer says, well, we need to make more of these. And Tony Hinds was to the forefront right along, because this was never Michael Carreras's, his cohort, his co-producer. They take turns That was not what he was particularly interested in. Even at his early times, he thought Hammer should be doing different things, which I always found funny because he really hadn't done any horror films yet. But Tony Hinds was driving once in a car with Len Harris, who was the camera operator. They had just secured the deal for their silent partner, Seven Arts, was with Elliot Hyman, to make a version of Frankenstein. And Tony said, we're gonna pop this out quick. It's gonna be 3 weeks, gonna be shot in black and white. But like Tony said, he did not like the script he was given. He had very little interest in it. But then he said, okay, now you can do your own script. You can make the film the way you want it. And that's when Jimmy Sangster came into the mix because of his work on X the Unknown and other things at Hammer. But The Curse of Frankenstein caught everybody off guard. It was marketed, they went to the United States, Warner Brothers made a fortune off of it. Hammer probably took a good chunk because, again, they would have had to put up some of the money. And it was decided then and there, if the first one made money, let's make another one just like it. And the obvious thing was, we've done Frankenstein, we do Dracula. Tony Hinds once said, I liked Frankenstein, but I watched the Bela Lugosi Dracula. It was slow and draggy, and I didn't much care for it. That was not going to be our Dracula. Jimmy Sangster tones down this epic, vast scope novel into basically shooting in the British countryside, even though it is supposed to be Transylvania, and a very small scope. And Tony Hinds pulled together all the groups that made Curse of Frankenstein, and we really solidified this Hammerland. These are the people. This is Terence Fisher. This is Bernard Robinson, the set designer. This is Jack Asher, the lighting cameraman. People who've been working the black and whites, like Len Harris, the camera operator, and Harry Oakes, the focus puller. All the group that were at Brace Studios, all the names that you would come to see again and again on the credits from, to me at least, the golden era of Hammer, which was 57 when Frankenstein came out, to about 1964, when Brace Studios plowed underneath their standing sets, and things changed. But during that period, the films that you want to see now, with the exception of The Mummy, which is Michael Carrera's, because supposedly Tony Hinds didn't care for The Mummy. But Tony Hinds loved Gothic literature. People say all Tony wanted to do was write. Tony once said to me, no, I didn't particularly want to be a writer, which is why it's so hard when you get information from people to know what is true. He also said he didn't care about Hammer or the writer talk about Hammer. I knew Tony Hinds from 1977 on, and that's all he talked about. His daughter once told me they would go for walks and Tony would talk nonstop about Hammer. Unfortunately, she said I was a young girl and I didn't care and I don't remember anything about it. But we have Dracula. It went out from Universal because they had seen how popular Frankenstein was and thought, we need to get in on this. The story is that Dracula saved Universal. Universal was on the verge of bankruptcy. Again, I'm not sure how accurately I say that is, that one film could turn a company away from bankruptcy, even a film that returns so much like Dracula. But it's a really nice story because Christopher Lee loves to tell it. Universal said, you can remake these films. They weren't really remakes, it is their versions. And Tony Hinds was on a roll. If there was a Gothic film to come along, the Tony Hinds stamp was on it. He was heavily involved in working on the scripts and not taking any credit. He knew what he had to work with, he knew what did he want out of his films, he knew how he wanted them to look. He once told me, and I hope I'm not being, he told me, I told me, but he did tell me these things. He was sort of a friend. Tony was too quiet to be a hail fellow well met, but he was my friend. He told me once, there were only 3 people at Hammer who truly understood what he wanted to do with the Gothic films. That was myself, Jimmy Sangster, and Terence Fisher. He said, and there was nobody else. We wanted this particular opulence. We wanted the decadence. Oftentimes we wanted the heroes to be very upper-class aristocratic shits. We wanted Frankenstein, the Baron, to be a shit. And you look at Meinster and Ravna and these other people, they're upper echelon. They look down on the underlings and the peasants below them, and they basically stunk as people. Hinds was quiet, almost shy. On his own, I don't think he could have raised cab fare. But once you had the money and you gave it to him, you were going to get something special. He went to California to work with Columbia and Screen Gems because James Correa thought, we need to get a television series made of Frankenstein, Tales of Frankenstein. Jimmy Sangster wrote scripts, other people. Hinds went over there and said, these people don't know what they're doing. And during the year 1959, most of the films were produced by Michael because he was back and forth in and out with Screen Gems and Columbia. Michael went over there and same decision. They don't know what they're doing. This is going to fail. And it did. It was black and white. It was closer to Inner Sanctum of the 1940s Universal than anything Hammer. It's curious that Columbia bought into Hammer to get Revenge of Frankenstein, which was Tony Hinds' follow-up. Same sets, same everybody, right after Horror Dracula. Yet they didn't seem to have a clue of what made these films special. They couldn't get through the hierarchy at Columbia. Oh no, we have to do it this way. This is the way we do it. This is the way Sam Katzman does it. This is the way Fred F. Sears directs them. We'll have Siodmak direct it. We'll make our Hammer film, but we'll put your name on it, but it damn well isn't a Hammer film, and Hinds knew it. So he comes back, and Universal wants another Dracula. And they'd wanted another Dracula from shortly after the first Dracula hit big. So Dracula 2 was in the works. It became Brides of Dracula. It went through Peter Bryan as the main screenwriter, but definitely Hinds was involved because he would do his old, every day I would look at the rushes, how many minutes, how many pages were we getting. I knew how long we had to shoot. I then knew how many minutes I had to get each day. If we were coming up short, then I'd have to go in and maybe add something. If we were coming up long, I'd look at it. And they always say, we just tear pages out, but I can't believe he just grabbed it, closed his eyes, and ripped pages out. I'm sure he knew the script. He looked at it and said, what can go? What can we not shoot and get us back in schedule? As usual, Peter Cushing was not happy with Jimmy Sangster's writing. And even though Peter Bryan was getting his credit, much of it was Jimmy Sangster up to this point. And Cushing he was not a troublemaker at Hammer, but Hinds once told me that Cushing had absolutely no respect for me. And he didn't think I had any talent, even though he'd never tell me that to my face. But Tony Hinds took the script, he talked to Cushing and said, I'll see what I can do, I'll get him someone else to rewrite it. He went to Edward Percy, who apparently somewhere along the line had written something that Cushing had acted in, maybe a play. He talked to Percy. Hinds said, all your suggestions are wonderful. Later said all his suggestions were terrible. However, when Cushing was interviewed later by the late Bill Kelly, they talked about some little specific bits and pieces that were added by Percy, at least according to Cushing, which added some dimension to the Van Helsing character. But Hinds finally got the film going very early January 1960 because they had a certain date it had to be delivered, which was summer of 1960. And Hinds and Hammer always thought it was odd these films were always children's matinees. Where over in the UK, these were adult films. Children couldn't even get into it. He worked with Terence Fisher. He worked with Jack Asher. He worked with Bernard Robinson as the designer. It is the penultimate Hammer film. It is the best film they ever made as far as I'm concerned, even though it's not the film I would show to a beginner. That would be Horror Dracula. And the film that made me a fan is Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. But Tony Hinds pulled everything together. He dealt with the personalities of Martita Hunt and Frida Jackson, who absolutely detested each other because they were always trying to upstage each other. He had to come down, he had to be a diplomat. They never cited examples, but he told me, yeah, they did not get along. They managed to make it in time. The film was a huge hit. But Tony comes back to the end of 1960, a chance to work with Terence Fisher again in The Curse of the Werewolf. And this is the first film that he really took any kind of credit on as a writer, although his fingerprint was over the scripts of everything he handled up to then. Tony Hinds eventually began to write for Hammer under his pseudonym of John Elder. It was based on names from the 1930s era of exclusive Hammer. Elder Wills had been a set designer and one of the supporting partners of the old exclusive. So he just made up this name. He always said he did it out of expediency. He said, I had to do this. And I think as it went along, I think he liked writing them. He was a creative man, but he was also more than aware than a standard screenwriter, unless it was someone like Jimmy Sangster, of what he had to work with. I think the most esoteric of all his films is Frankenstein Created Woman. I mean, the whole idea of capturing the soul, of transferring it from the dead boy's body to the body of the deformed Christine. He could have easily gravitated to what he did was Evil of Frankenstein, which was, okay, I'm supposed to make a universal Frankenstein, but guys, we're going to have a universal Frankenstein monster. But when left to his own devices, we got Frankenstein Created Woman. I wonder if people, particularly young people, going to the double feature of that and The Mummy Shroud, they would have gotten more pleasure out of The Mummy Shroud, but they would have walked out of Frankenstein Created Woman wondering about it. It's such a melancholy movie. You see Christine at the end, I'm sorry. You see one by one as she kills young men who framed and killed her boyfriend. This is about as far afield as A Monster on the Loose of 1940s Universal or even The Evil of Frankenstein as possible to be. I think this is John Elder Tony Hinds when he said, okay, I can write this.
Who am I? Who am I?
Tony was a hands-on and a not hands-on producer. One person would say, including Tony, I'm always on the set. Another person would say, Tony was never on the set, but he always kept the mic on the set live so he could hear what was going on. One person would say, if he heard it, he'd come rushing down to fix the problem. Jimmy Sangster wrote, if he heard it, he jumped in his car and he left because he didn't want to be around the problem. I asked Tony about that once. He said, well, it's possible I did that, but if you know where Ray Studios was, it was in the middle of nowhere and I'm not sure exactly where I drove off to.
Pepe the Watchman has a silver bullet. Get it and use it. Use it on me, Father. You must use it, do you hear? You must use it, you must.
Curse of the Werewolf went out, didn't make a lot of money. The next one to come down the pike of the major Gothics was 1961 in Phantom of the Opera. A story that most Hammer fans know, that Cary Grant approached Hammer and said, I like your movies, I'd like to make one. Tony always said he knew his agent would never let him make it, but he went ahead and wrote it, and as it happened, Cary Grant didn't make it. There's always been an argument, was Cary Grant going to play the Phantom? Was he going to play the young male lead? I believe it was the Phantom. But everybody's always saying, but even Tony Hinds, I cannot find record where he said he was going to play which role. Phantom of the Opera, most expensive Hammer film of the time, made a small fortune in the United States, failed miserably in relation to what they expected for Hammer in the UK, and Hammer's money came out of the UK release, not out of the USA release. First assistant director was John Pevrow, and he used to not have a lot of respect for Tony Hinds. He said he would make cuts, like there was a machine that was supposed to raise the curtain up and down at the Opera House. Well, he canceled it. And so for a whole morning, Terence Fisher couldn't get the scene shot. And he said, for God's sakes, John, why can't we get this done? Well, somebody canceled the motor. Can you guess who? Hinds? Phantom of the Opera, I think it's the best of the Phantom films. I know more people like Chaney, but that's the character. I think as a film, it's the best. Tony next year did Kiss of the Vampire, another successful film for Universal. The following year, he did Evil of Frankenstein and The Gorgon for Columbia, but they actually lost money on it according to the way they did it. It's at that time Tony Hinds told James Carreras, we have to make these cheaper. We can't make money on the Gothics the way we're doing it now. That's why you saw in 1965, they did 4 of them back to back. They weren't done as cheaply as they thought, but they're still only a little over 100,000 pounds of film. But by 1964, Tony did Die, Die, My Darling. Michael Carreras had stormed out one more time, arguing with his father, because Tony said they were always exploding. Michael was always flying out of the office. Tony Hinds, was forced to come in to become executive producer. He still kept his eyes on it. If pages needed to be removed, like Don Sharp said, pages had to come out of Rasputin. It was running long, they were running over budget. Was he physically on the set ripping out pages, or was he sitting in the office with a script? Because ripping to me was just, it sounds nice. But what you had was, okay, maybe scene X, Y, and Z can be removed in pages 85 through 87. This will get us back on budget and on time. That could be ripping out the scripts. Do I think he went down on the set and did it? Who knows, but no, I think he did it in his office. He kept this watch over the Hammers. He saw the bigger budgets coming. He tried to hold them down because 7 Arch and the others were pressuring him, but they also wanted to make bigger films. Hammer thought, well, we can make more money, but unfortunately they cost more, but they didn't make more money. By 1968, Hammer had a wonderful $3 million television deal with 20th Century Fox and ABC TV, and they were going to make A Journey to the Unknown. Unfortunately, they said, Tony Hinds doesn't know anything about producing for television. He became, as he said, a glorified production manager. He said, I did it because I was sold as part of the process. I hated every second of it. I liked the people I worked for, but I was used to being my own boss, and I hated it. On the last week of shooting, they had a fight on one of the last episodes of Union over overtime. He was pissed off. He resigned his membership in the union. He continued to work for Hammer, like in Frankenstein, Must Be Destroyed. He's the one who's told Tony Nelson Keyes, come back, you can do our next Frankenstein, but you gotta write the script, which Keyes did with Burt Batt. But by mid-1969, he had lost all interest. He never wanted to be there, really. There was some controversy over whether he lifted scenes from a Kevin Francis submitted script that became Taste of Blood of Dracula. So it was suggested he resign his directorship and leave Hammer. He was probably gone by the end of 1969, but his name was on the letterhead to middle of 1970. Although he left Hammer, he never really left Hammer. He was in the office all the time, according to the business manager, Brian Lawrence. He would write encouraging letters to Michael Carreras when things were going down the tubes. He would write scripts for Michael for free, but he would never come back. To be honest, what good could he have done? He couldn't raise money any more than Michael could. I got to know Tony Hinds about 1976, 77. He had given us a little interview, but at that time he really did not want part of anything to do with Hammer as far as fandom or talking about what he did. His road answer was, I don't remember anything about anything. But in 1978, I sent him Little Shop of Horrors #4, our Mammoth Hammer issue. He wrote back to me and said, my God, your issue #4. I learned more about Hammer than in the 20 very odd years I worked there, including I found out what John Gilling thought of me. And John Gilling made some rather nasty remarks about Anthony Hinds. Anthony Hinds kept telling me I don't remember anything, but I have a stack of letters over the next 30, 35, 40 years that tells me, yes, he did. He became a bit of a world traveler. He'd live overseas. He'd live in Spain. He'd come back to England. He's moved from place to place to place. I would constantly say, where's he at? I'd write Hammer, they may have his address. I'd contact his cohort at Hammer, Michael Carreras, he might have an answer. I'd write to Tony and then we start off like we hadn't left off. Towards the end, he had Parkinson's, he had a caretaker. His wife was still with him. He had 2 daughters and 5 grandchildren he doted on. In his last letter to me, he wrote, my gosh, all these people, I love reading your magazine and finding out where all these people, where they're at, and they're all dead, they're all gone. He had gone full circle to not ever wanting to talk about Hammer, to be willing to understand I was the one behind it. If you're talking Hammer today, and he wouldn't say this, but I do, you're talking about the films that I produced. The rest of them are all good. 1 Million Years BC was good. They did a lot of wonderful films. But you're talking Dracula and the first Frankenstein. You're talking Brides of Dracula. You're talking Tony Hinds. Tony Hinds once told me I'd walk through the woods and go through the spider webs in the morning and I'd just think. I wouldn't write story lines and that. I'd formulate it in my head. I had a good idea. I liked the name Paul. I liked names that had initials that were easy to type because when I wrote a script, it was KD or PJ or whatever. But I'd simply walk through the woods, get an idea, how am I going to get Dracula back into a story that doesn't have Dracula in it? He said, I like the Dracula character, but what was there for him to do? I like writing for Frankenstein, because Frankenstein, as I said before, was a shit, but he was an entertaining shit. Maybe it was expediency that Tony Hinds became John Elder. He said he didn't want to be a writer when he was younger, but other people said all Tony wanted to be was a writer. So you get diametrically opposed views. But I think at the end of the day, he liked writing. He continued to write. He submitted scripts after scripts to Hammer. At least one of his scripts was used in Hammer House of Horrors. He submitted more scripts to Roy Skaggs for other series. More so as producer, any other aspect of it, he liked being John Elder. He liked writing. Don Sharp said it once in a documentary, when they lost John Elder, when they lost Tony Hinds, he was Hammer. He understood what made up the classic Hammer films. People say they couldn't have continued on with what they did in the 50s, but I think they could have evolved, still in the Hammer style, still in the Hammer feel, upgraded to the 70s. As much as I like Vampire Circus, I would have liked to seen that story undertaken by John Elder. He might have made an effort to keep more of the older Hammer people coming and maintain a bit of the Hammer look. I think we could have had a meld of Hammerland of the 50s and what Hammer produced in the 70s if John Elder and Tony Hinds had stuck around. I once said, do we need to do a biography of you? And he said, I'm afraid I'll walk into a store and it'll be sitting in a remainder bin. He, to the end, was shy about it. He just never would come across. If Michael Carreras, as I said, was the most important person at Hammer, Tony Hinds was the only reason we remember Hammer today.